That should be there now. Yes, it is. Wonderful. Thank you all very much for coming and for listening. Thank you, Sue, for introducing me so nicely and kindly. My name is Alys Einion, and I am currently working at the University of Dundee, which is wonderful. I love it there. And I'm really excited to talk about this because this is a topic I'm really, really passionate about. And I may get a little carried away. One of the things I want to do before I begin is to acknowledge that I'm speaking from a place of privilege. I cannot speak from an insider perspective on many of the issues around anti-oppressive practice, but I do have some insider knowledge for some issues. So I just want to acknowledge that an awful lot of what I've included in today's presentation comes from the work of other people who've stood up, spoken up, and made changes to try and improve the provision of midwifery care and maternity services. And I'm just a voice. What matters is that we get going with this conversation. And that's really where I'm coming from. So we can see anti-oppressive practice is something that's both a theory and an approach. And I think that's something we can all get our heads around. There's a whole theory and body of research around anti-oppressive practice anyway, but it's also an approach. It's an active entity that's got a lot of scope, and it covers any and all forms of inequity and power. So often in our services and in our spaces, we talk about things like equality, diversity, inclusion. We talk about inclusive practices, but this is all about any form of unbalance where some people have more power than others. And it is an approach to social issues and to people's lived experience, which looks on at how larger systems create and protect unearned privilege and power that some groups have because of our societies, because of our histories. And that, at the same time, creates, maintains, and upholds difficult and inequitable conditions for other groups of people. So we know that we don't want there to be any inequity, but there is. It's clear there is, and we need to think about how to address it. Because the inequitable conditions that are created by the systems that we live in, the systems we practice in, the systems that people experience midwifery care and maternity care in, they lead to power imbalances between the people who have certain types of privilege and the people who don't, or the people who are marginalized versus the people who tend to be centralized by the kind of services we provide. So what we do in anti-oppressive practice is to center the experience of equity-deserving groups and identities so that we can build structures and systems that work for everyone. And although this seems quite weighty and it's quite theory-heavy and it seems very important, it actually is something we all have the power to engage in. So just as a bit of background on what we mean by oppression, I found a wonderful resource that helps to actually look at the way oppression works in our society. And this model is a really good way of understanding why it is we need anti-oppressive practice, because it looks at the three interacting levels of oppression within our society. There's structural, there's cultural, and then there's personal. So as you can see, the structural type of oppression is when entities and organizations who are responsible for distributing resources and delegating power in society actually create conditions of inequity. And that there's examples there of what kind of entities and organizations we're talking about. And as you can see there, this includes education systems and healthcare systems, which are our business as midwives. Then there's cultural oppression, and this is about language and categorization, the way we label things, the way we design things even, that contribute to oppression by influencing our cultural values and creating structures that label groups of people as either dominant or other. And that then leads to further inequality and inequity. So examples of that are white versus racial minority. And I know the language around how to describe people of diverse ethnic backgrounds is changing. So I would prefer to say minoritized ethnic groups, but in this source, they use this term. There are things that, such as heteronormative versus non-heteronormative systems and languages, neurotypical versus neurodivergent. These are just some examples. And then at the personal level, oppression is about individual interactions, everyday work practices, and the values we hold and may share with others. And this could be, for example, discrimination against a person based on prejudicial thoughts, microaggressions enacted against people. But we do know that when we look at this, each of these feeds into the other. But the place where we have power is in this personal domain. And that personal domain can bring about and help to bring about change in the other domains. But obviously, the other domains change far more slowly. Now, it's really relevant for us as midwives because our heritage is grounded in supporting people, and often the people who've been historically oppressed and marginalized. So women, minoritized Black and ethnic women and parents, women who are poorer, immigrant women, disabled, neurodiverse, people of diverse gender and sexuality are all part of our history. But we are an oppressed profession as well. Now, this may be an unfashionable topic in midwifery, but we are bound up in the emancipation of women and of other oppressed people. And we are also bound up in our own professionalization, and it's a very female occupation. So we need to look at this insider stance on midwifery as it's understood within our dominant Western global North Eurocentric model. Those of us who are enculturated in that system, which is born from these colonial, patriarchal and capitalist structures, the ones that really do have multiple impacts on people who bear children and the people who attend them, we can undo our legacy of oppression and injustice and make the changes that are needed to ensure midwifery grows beyond its history, its regulation and its limitations, so that we are aligned with and centered on unconditional and respectful care of women and birthing people. And this is why I'm so driven to do this, because I really feel that we have so much that we bring to bear in midwifery, and so much power to rather than power over. But sometimes people don't feel confident to challenge oppressive structures and conditions. Part of this comes from our heritage because we have been oppressed, and this is partly because we were demonized in the past. And that legacy has carried over to now, a defensive legacy that was, we were actively characterized by the establishment, by those powerful structures as dirty, ignorant and incompetent. We've been fighting against that. We have established midwifery as a research-led, holistic profession of specialists, but we remain feminized in a landscape that's patriarchal, feminized and therefore placed in a position where we are considered less than. Often when we've got positive narratives, the midwife trope is similar to that of the nurse as an angel of mercy, as if it's something that we do because we're women, when actually what we have is really powerful expertise. So I'm coming to this with a sense of moral obligation and justice. I've got this privilege, but I want to use it to change the context in which we provide care and support women and parents and each other. And I want you to come along on that journey with me. Is oppression really an issue? I can hear you asking. It is, because the systems that we work in legitimize medical staff's power over women during childbirth. This relates to some other challenges, the manifestation of gender stereotypes, where women and midwives are expected to adhere to stereotypical norms of femininity, such as submissiveness, not something I've ever been able to adhere to, by the way. And this expectation and the manifestation of these stereotypes can lead to shame, and midwives are also prone to feeling this shame. So there's this good mother trope that we're supposed to behave in certain ways, and this restricts mothers when they enter into maternity care and restricts midwives. And certain groups, people, identities are more likely to experience the oppression of that restriction. We are guilty of our own forms of oppression as midwives, and I own that, because we practice within cultures that too often marginalize, other, or exclude, often through subtle microaggressions, people who do not follow some kind of indefinable cultural norm. And if anybody can actually define those norms for me, I would really welcome that, because I'm still trying to figure them out. It applies to ourselves in our professional spaces and workplaces. We have ingrained cultures, and we know that those cultures need to grow and change and evolve to become more supportive for us, for student midwives, for our colleagues, and for the women we care for. And that's really important, I believe, because I also know and believe that action to change is happening all over the country and all over the world. But I also believe that much more can be done, and that it begins and ends with us, because we're all complicit in the system, and there is no judgment here. There is nothing other than recognizing the power of the system and what we have to do to function within it. But we still do have the power to change our profession and practice for the better. We saw in the video we just watched how the RCM in the UK are looking at research priorities because they're invested in the evolution of our profession as something that can actively change the maternity care landscape. But I sometimes feel, actually, I quite often feel that we don't feel empowered to do that for ourselves and for the environment that we work in and for our colleagues and the women we work with. We do need to acknowledge our own privilege, and we need to understand its impact. And we must accept that cultures of oppression cannot be allowed to continue. So what is anti-oppressive practice in the context of midwifery, and how can we practice it? To begin with, and I think this is important because providing you with some practical tools is one thing saying there's oppression. Another thing is say, well, what can we do? We need to feel able to do things. So let's start with becoming conscious of and taking responsibility for our knowledge, our perspectives, and our ways of seeing the world, recognizing how we see the world, and then following up on our need to truly learn to see through the eyes of others, to be able to actively set aside the filters and the assumptions and the histories of our perceptions and trying to see the world as others see it. We all have assumptions and bias, and these are cognitive shortcuts that we all have that enable our brains to categorize objects and assign them a status as safe or not safe. Bias tends to be much more personal, but our assumptions are largely based in group thinking and group shared norms. So one of the things we can start to do, and it is a daily practice, and it's not something you ever fully achieve because you keep having to grow and learn, is to try and move beyond this, because we do have that capacity. So we can actively develop our awareness of multiple perspectives on our profession, our role, our behaviours, and how we can respect others in their uniqueness, just as we respect ourselves. And there's a lot we can do to try and think, well, what do I not know in this context? I know what I know, and I know what I don't know, but I don't always know what I don't know. So there's work to be done having conversations with people, frank conversations about how they are experiencing midwifery as colleagues, as service users. And one of the things I've said for many years in my practice is never assume anything, except an occasional air of intelligence. We can work by challenging our own assumptions and recognizing when they happen. Because advocacy, which is what we really need to do in anti-oppressive practice, has always been part of our role, but without self-awareness, it's an empty term. And challenging our own assumptions is really difficult, but it's a really good thing to do when we want to recognize oppression, our own and others. And one of the things we can do is not accept a status differential between us and others, because the medical hierarchy is not fixed or inevitable. We're all the same. We're all on the same level. It takes a bit of work to do that. It takes a bit of work to establish a landscape in which we're all equal on the same level. We're all seeing each other and regarding each other with the same degree of respect, because we are in those structures and hierarchies. It's about learning to see people as people. It's about a mindfulness where we enter into a situation with a person and see them as a person first, and it takes mental practice. It's a mental habit. We see them as who and what they are at the time they come to us. And while we're doing that, start to recognize the filters and other influences that can affect our perception of them. It is not always easy to see what our own filters and assumptions are, but we're perfectly capable of learning each other's histories on our own. And I think taking time to know people as they are and as they present themselves to us gives us a chance to better understand the lived experience of the now for us and for them, for all of us. And that's grounded in diversity, because we're all different. We may have many things in common. We're all different, and in subjectivity, and we can celebrate that. There's so much to learn from each other. It just sometimes feels like hard work, because we have to have hard conversations with other people and with ourselves, and sometimes face hard truth. So it's listening to and respecting others' lived experiences. And that helps us develop this awareness of each other and our biases and our preconceptions and allow us to move beyond them and to not be afraid to be challenged and not be afraid to be uncomfortable while we're learning each other, to discover, oh, actually, I've just said something that was not good or was experienced by someone else as uncomfortable. To own that and to take responsibility for that is quite hard. And I've blushed with shame so many times in conversations because I've realized I've made a complete faux pas or I've not realized where someone else is coming from. But it's about accepting that and moving through it to create this shared landscape. But it's a challenge because gender, race, class, and other stereotypes and expectations are so deeply entrenched in our cultures. And they are so powerfully presented and represented again and again in so many social spaces as the norm. So becoming anti-oppressive is quite difficult. So I'm lucky because so many people have written about this. But reproductive oppression is based in the systems of power that are invested in control of our reproductive freedoms. And I know this is political, but it's true. And this is particularly important for multiply marginalized groups. We cannot just see people as one characteristic or one bit of oppression. Actually, people are intersectional and they can be experiencing oppression from many different angles and for many different reasons. So some of the literature that we have has shown links between obstetric violence and obstetric racism. And an example of this is diagnostic lapse, where racist assumptions lead to inappropriate diagnosis, to neglect, to dismissively or disrespectful care, or failure to properly manage pain. So in their example, this is in Black people. Also, they can result in coercion and humiliation and shaming of Black people. And I'm focusing on racism in this presentation because it is one of the most evident challenges of midwifery at the moment. There are multiple forms of oppression in our midwifery spaces, but racism has really come to the fore. And we can see that medical racism is one of the root causes of the inequalities in outcomes between Black and white women. So we need to challenge this. This does need to change. We know it exists. The literature shows us. When we think about this, some of the literature is quite shocking, and this is where you may feel uncomfortable, and I certainly did when I was researching this topic. The use of medical intimidation to control the behavior of labouring people is an explicit strategy found in hospitals where hierarchy determines who has the power to make decisions over medical care. And for some people, and this is research that was based in America, but it does have relevance for us, they fear entering into maternity services. They fear this state-sanctioned racial violence as part of their experience and the power of the system to intervene and to threaten them with, for example, the removal of their children. And I know in the UK, we do have similar experiences. Another feature is isolation. So we need to recognize how systemic racism and other forms of oppression infiltrate and undermine maternity care in particular. So what I want to say to you is something I've always said to my students and colleagues, that regardless of any of our identities, protected characteristics, or anyone else's, we should be practicing unconditional positive regard. This was one of the most powerful lessons I was taught in my midwifery education a very long time ago. I won't say how long, by somebody I respected so much. And we can learn to practice unconditional positive regard, caring for people as they are, respecting them as they are, and looking at what we have to offer them at any given point in their childbearing journey, because we are offering and they are taking from us what they need. And that stops it being about power. We can provide humanistic care because where there is diversity, we can work respectfully and we can have a healthy curiosity that enables us to integrate different knowledges and viewpoints into our vision. Scientific rationalism is brilliant. Science, evidence-based practice, research gives us lots of ways of addressing aspects of reproductive biology, health determinant interventions and care that are value to mothers in their pregnancy and perinatal journeys. But we need to provide care that is humanistic, that respects individuality and autonomy. And in this, focus on how to bring about change. We can't hold individuals accountable for systemic abuse, but we have to hold them accountable for their individual behaviours and for not resisting this. We can't change our institutions until we change our culture. So we have to, unfortunately, but fortunately, make visible the problematic aspects of any culture that leads to institutional dominance and to the oppression of peoples, persons, and cultures. We all have something in common somewhere, and where there's commonality, we can all find a shared voice. And that's something we need to remember, is that we're not the lone voice in the wilderness. We're not the tall poppy leaning up above the parapet. We are actually many. And as a shared voice, we have power. So we can be allies to anyone, whatever our experience is, whatever our personal or professional history, we can learn to stand beside those who need our strength or our non-judgmental presence. And here is a model, the references on the slide, for becoming an effective ally, because these are the 4 degrees of allyship or non-allyship, moving from apathetic to advocate. And it is a set of actions, or a process of evolution, where we move through our knowledge and understanding of the oppressions and inequities that happen in our practice towards being routinely and proactively advocating for others. We can promote respectful practice using research, using the systems and processes that exist in our hierarchical institutions. We can use research to promote respectful practice and carry out that kind of research. So I've given you an example here from Australia that looked at a practical approach to assessing cultural competence. We can take tools like this and we can use them intersectionally. We can adapt them through dialogue with our communities and through co-production to look at the kinds of privilege, inequity, potential and actual oppression that exist in our own institutions. That then gives us a springboard and an evidence base and a movement and a momentum to address systemic racism and all forms of oppression. We can also be aware of microaggressions. Now, I've put this slide in because I went to a really good presentation with a colleague yesterday who was looking at allyship, and another colleague who was discussing microaggressions. And we can actually become aware of these and challenge them. We can challenge them in ourselves, and we can, when we see them, call them out. So microaggressions are subtle, intentional, or sometimes unintentional interactions or behaviors that communicate some sort of bias towards historically marginalized groups. And they may be labeled as micro, they may be small, appear small things, but they actually can have a huge impact on a person's life. And they can make people feel like they don't belong or they don't want to belong. So one of the things I would say is take a look at what kinds of microaggressions can be experienced by the people in your workplace and your life. We can also be radically honest about this. We have to acknowledge our past and present failings of our systems and the drive and need to change these. We must never, ever minimize the oppressions that are documented, observed, and experienced by women and midwives. So we need to look honestly at the places in which oppression is experienced and by whom, and then take action to counter it. We need to learn actively to be anti-racist, anti-discriminatory, positively inclusive. Everyone has the right to dignity. And it's up to us to help each other to move into that state of radical honesty, and radical honesty is very uncomfortable. So to this end, I offer this suggestion. In any given situation in your role, ask yourself, who is excluded right now? Who might feel left out or feel as if they're not seen or heard? Who is not being considered? Whose needs are not accounted for? Does that BAME colleague or the colleague with a strong accent experience discrimination in practice? Are students overhearing homophobic remarks from staff or patients? Does anyone feel excluded from the team's professional and social activities? Is that planned activity accessible to neurodiverse people or people with caring responsibilities? And the list could go on and on and on. We can ask, as we practice our awareness, how might this person I am with right now be experiencing this situation, given what I know about them and the social and societal forces affecting them? If this mother is affected by homophobia, or that mother by sizeism and weight stigma, or this family by being refugees, or that mother by racial injustice, how can I tailor my care to support them most effectively? What do I need to do to know that? Who needs to be involved? And how can I humbly guide this person to have the best possible experience of childbearing or of their working life, whilst I have the privilege of working with them? So you can be the change, and we harken right back to the old activism, but be the change, be the person who sees the barriers for yourself and others, helps others over around them, or even better, one of the people who helps to remove them. You can challenge language or behavior that needs to be challenged. You can role model respect, evidence it, role model it, and role model inclusive practice. Where oppression exists, get involved, organize, change the script for yourself. You can change your own script. And when you start changing your own script, other people follow. You'd be amazed at the power of just changing the words you use, for example. Other people will follow along. It'll be uncomfortable at first. You might get some funny looks. I certainly have. But it actually does work. And we can then together nurture this shared recognition of why it's so important and evidence the change that we need to make in the world. I want to also include a word on fear, because I know that medicalized maternity care would have you working like machines, speeding patients along the conveyor belt, never having a real moment to humanly connect and share that experience. It would have you too afraid to speak up for fear of risk to yourself and your own career. Well, as another colleague once said to me, action cures fear. Remember, the legislative framework that underpins our practice, the code, requires us to practice in an inclusive, anti-oppressive manner. So if you're working according to the code and you're working according to the law, you are unassailable. And if you're using evidence to support your action, you're doing what is required of you as a midwife. There is no reason why you should suffer for standing up for what is right. We are all walking histories, and we're roadmaps of every prejudice or assumption that closed off or changed our route through life or affected how easy or difficult our path might be. All bodies, all selves are different, yet we're all here together, you and I, walking, stumbling, dancing our way forward through this vast and complex terrain of life. So, whatever setting you work with, whoever you work with, however complex needs a mother or family might have, whatever anybody's history, experience, personality, we all belong to humanity. We all deserve proper care, recognition, respect, and belonging. So the final thing I want to say to you is this. If someone tells you they are experiencing any form of oppression, believe them. Believe in them. Act in every way with the only assumption you are allowed to make. The assumption that their experience is true and valid, because it is. I have included a useful resource here from Oxfam on anti-racism, which I found very, very educational. And I have also included my references on my PowerPoint. I want to say thank you.